Hi, some of you want to know something about me, so here goes. My name is Mark Willen. This is a little bit about me from the inner viewpoint. In 1970, I was tricked by a fake Indian sect when I was living in Paris. And basically, my father, who had been in the Indian Army during World War II and spoke Indian languages, basically blackmailed me out. And I realized at that point that I'd been tricked. And so I started to look for a proper path of inner development and used the Kabbalah because it came from a tradition, being the Jewish Christian tradition, which I knew to be reliable, and I started doing exercises and in particular ceremonial magic in London and in Manchester in 1971. At the end of 1973 in Milan, in Italy, I met Rocco, then Bruno, Babi, and Fulvio. I am only giving first names of people who are still alive. If they consent to give their surname, then they will be stated. But at the moment, I'm just giving first names. In 1974, then I made a trip to Trieste in Italy and met Fabio Franco and others and started doing exercises daily. I have not stopped apart from 1 week with severe flu since then. In 1974, I returned to Manchester and had my first meetings with Michael Wilson, who is the former president of the Anthroposophical Society in Great Britain. In 1975, I had the first of a series of hour-long annual meetings then with Massimo Scaligero in Rome, with whom I'd been corresponding. And in 1979, after a congress on the future of the spiritual science in England, I was bitterly disappointed at the attitude that emanated from Switzerland, and I resigned from the first class and from the Anthroposophical Society at that point. In 1986, I emigrated to France, to Paris initially, and then in 1984 I started a series of meetings with Gerhard Klockenbring, who was then at the Christian community in Paris, in which I eventually became an elder myself. In 1996 I started a series of phone calls with Kulevind in Hungary and also corresponded with Prokofiev in Dornach. At 2001, I attended the Michael Congress in Dornach just after the 9/11 attacks in America. And as a result of these, I had meetings and correspondence with the Vorstand after that. This eventually was followed by my emigration to Singapore and Malaysia and Vietnam in 2006. And in 2017 I made a temporary return to Italy, though it looks very likely that I will probably end my days in Southeast Asia. A few words about my masters and human allies, and here I'm not referring to the alliance that we all have, almost as a birthright, with Christ and with the Archangel Michael. The first and probably the most important influence upon my work, as intended as a practitioner of the inner path of spiritual science, is Massimo Scaligero. He was known by me personally and by several of my friends, including those I have mentioned earlier by first name. His emphasis was on the practice of the path for the new epoch. And that is absolutely vital because, frankly, there's no point in Rudolf Steiner having written many meditative texts and given so many exercises if nobody's going to damn well do them. His further contribution was on the nature of sacred love and the search for the Holy Grail. And his viewpoint, which I have later come to espouse to some degree, is that there is no need for any outer structure at all for the inner work. Many of his works are still available, in Italian that is, and more are now being translated into English. Michael Henry Wilson, this photograph was probably 20 or 30 years before I met him. He was already a considerably old man by the time I did. He was the first ever non-native German-speaking class reader and official translator for the English version of the class. He was president of the UK Anthroposophical Society after Owen Barfield, of whom I will speak later. He was a musician, former first violin under Sir Adrian Boult at the the London Philharmonic, and also co-founded the English National Opera. And he was also an industrial scientist, having studied chemistry and physics at university. But he gave all that up in order to educate the handicapped, and he spent his entire life on this, and also wrote a couple of books on the light from a Goethean scientific viewpoint. Unfortunately, those books are now unfindable. I had the privilege not just of having him as my class reader and of having extensive conversations with him, but also being invited to his home in Clent, near Stourbridge, and to discuss inner work. And he told me that he had had traces of there being a hidden operative circle for the exercises, which was founded by Steiner during his lifetime, but had no external visible existence whatsoever, though there were obviously signs of recognition that were available to members. He had come across 4 or 5 references to this at various points in his life in Germany and elsewhere, but had never actually been able to contact them. His comment, which I think gives you a measure of the man, was this: truth becomes truth only when it passes through the human heart. Gerard Clockenbrink is also a very important person. He was a Protestant theologian since 1948 and co-founder of the Christian community in Paris and Strasbourg. For many years he was co-director of the seminary in Stuttgart in Germany, and he was a tireless lecturer and gave lectures every week in Paris for decades. But I think it is fair to point out that although he's the author of several books that are still available in translation, there were many times when he gave lectures to maybe no more than 4 or 5 people. And this is a measure of the self-sacrifice that he made. Him and Michael Wilson. Michael Wilson was fighting an uphill struggle against the powers in Dornach that wanted to stop any practice of the inner path. Gerard Clockenbrink was faced with utter disinterest, and only Massimo Scaligero seems to have been able to propose this and find support. I might add, the 3 men I regard as being very similar caliber. They are men who had one particular feature, which was that when you met them, they waited for you to bring out from your own being your own question before they started telling you anything about what they themselves bore within. And that is a very powerful inner attitude. Other operators that I regard to be relatively reliable were Georg Kuhlewind, who studied under Massimo Scaligero, and I never actually met him because we could never arrange a meeting. I was travelling in and out of Budapest. Unfortunately, my visits tended to coincide with times when he was not there, and so we never actually met, though we did speak on the phone a few times, and he did confirm to me what I had already suspected, that is the role within the society of a kind of ostracism for anybody that spoke of actually working inwardly. And although several of his books are available and many more are being translated now, and they are at a very high level, particularly with regard to the working of the word, unfortunately, he was put to one side by the powers that be in Dornach, and remained so until the end of his life. Sergei Prokofiev, on the other hand, had a different kind of, let us say, impact, in that he was self-taught and appeared after the fall of the wall at Dornach and asked to be able to make a presentation, because under the circumstances of following anthroposophy under the Soviet system in Russia, he was, and many of his fellow Russians were, self-taught as regards the inner path, and he therefore became accepted as a Vorstand member in Dornach in Switzerland, and is probably, to my mind, a case of spiritual economy, in that he probably bears the etheric body of one of the anthroposophical pioneers. There are other cases I could refer to. Several books were written and are available, and more are being translated of those. The early works need to be set to one side because he was self-taught. He, in fact, lacked the perspective that comes from working with people who have many years of inner experience upon their shoulders, and therefore can tell you what is not reliable as opposed to what is, and therefore his early works are to be set to one side, to my mind, as involving mainly personal or subjective impressions. However, I also suspect that this self-taught aspect that led the Anthroposophic Society after 2001 to start promoting doing exercises without any consultation of those people who had real valid contributions to bring forward, and therefore this has been largely a failure. Reliable allies are people that I think were precursors of my time, who I have not had any personal contact with, but who have contributed greatly, although they're not in the first generation of pioneers of the Anthroposophical Society. They had a considerable impact in the years that immediately followed, and they are Giovanni Colazza, because he was a first-generation student of Rudolf Steiner's, the author of an absolutely wonderful book on the book Initiation, or Knowledge of Worlds and How to Attain It, and that book is practical comments on the exercises that are contained in the book and how to carry them out. Fantastic in that respect. Owen Barfield was a great friend of two people that are well known, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and he was former president of the Anthroposophical Society in Great Britain. During the years in which the Anthroposophical Society was cut off from the Anthroposophical Society in Dornach, presumably because of the insistence of actually doing inner work, though he, I think, had an enormous influence upon both Lewis and Tolkien in their work. Bernard Levergood was his, let's say, opposite number in Holland, and his work on transformation of organizations and so on is something that is of great impact, and I think I can say that from what I've seen of his work, it is important in its own sphere, and of a similar sort of weight to the impact that the other two have had. Thank you for your attention. That gives you an idea about where I come from. I have been, as I say, practicing every day for many years, and will continue to do so until I'm no longer able to. Thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, this is where to go to contact me. Thank you. Bye.